On Saturday, June 14, 2014, in Raleigh, North Carolina, the bride, Brianna Ellington, couldn't hide the tears behind her veil. Her bouquet trembled as she stared at the empty space meant for her fiancé, Cole Harrington. She's crying because it's 11:42 a.m., 47 minutes past the scheduled wedding start, and the man who should already be her husband still hasn't arrived. She had called several times, but each time the calls went straight to voicemail, across the aisle. The best man dialed countless times, each ending the same way, no answer. She shook her head through tears, the words slipping out in a broken whisper only those nearest could hear. Unease spread through the sanctuary. Guests shifted in their seats, the air thick with restlessness. In their quiet community, a missing groom was more than a scandal. It was unthinkable. At the pulpit, Pastor Marcus Ellington stood rigid, his hands locked on the Bible. To the congregation he looked like a man bracing his family through a storm. But his silence was unsettling. His gaze, flicking again and again to the unopened doors, betrayed a tension no sermon could mask. Brianna's sobs broke through the hush. Her bridesmaids tried to steady her, whispering comfort, but the words bounced against her grief. The bouquet slipped from her grasp, petals scattering across the floor like fragments of a broken promise. The celebration unraveled before their eyes. The music, the flowers, the vows prepared in love. Each detail turned hollow, stripped of meaning in the absence of the groom. And still, no Cole. The whispers swelled, speculation thickening with every minute. Some imagined doubt, others betrayal. Yet Brianna's heart rejected it all. She knew the man she loved. Cole Harrington was not a coward. He was not a liar. He would never leave her standing there. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The church fractured into two currents of thought. One offered sympathy for the abandoned bride, the other fed scandal, searching for reasons, excuses, shadows. But beneath all the noise, a heavier question pressed into every mind. Where was Cole Harrington? And as that question echoed, another thought stirred quietly, dangerously. Not everyone believed in hesitation. Not everyone believed in runaway grooms. The groom had vanished on the day he was meant to begin forever. And with each passing hour, suspicion inched closer to the one man no one in that sanctuary ever expected to doubt. 18 months earlier in Raleigh, before dresses were chosen and invitations mailed, Brianna Ellington was rebuilding a quiet life. She worked her shifts, checked in on neighbors, stopped by the church office to help with sign-ups and food drives. After losing her mother, she kept her world small. Routine over risk, calm over chaos. Then a volunteer day brought a new name onto the sign-in sheet, Cole Harrington. It wasn't a grand entrance, no spotlight. He arrived early, rolled up the loading bay door at the fellowship hall, and started moving cases of canned goods without being asked. When a dolly wheel stuck, he fixed it with a pocket tool and kept going. He wasn't loud. He wasn't selling himself. He just worked until the pallets were gone, and the floor gleamed again. We watched him wipe his hands, thank the coordinator, and offer to stack extra folding chairs before he left. Dependable looks like that. Quiet, consistent, done right the first time. Brianna noticed the same details everyone else did. No fuss, no shortcuts, no complaints when the schedule slipped. But she also noticed how he checked on people, how he made space for an older volunteer to pass with a walker, how he stayed late when the last box didn't find a home. She asked where he was from. Raleigh, born and raised. She asked what he did. A licensed electrician with a small contractor off Glenwood, the kind of job that's measured in crawl spaces, breaker panels, and calls after midnight when a storm knocks a line. He didn't pretend to be more. He didn't pretend to be less. Their first coffee wasn't planned. The truck he drove wouldn't start. He laughed once, shook his head, and said he knew exactly which relay had died. She waited with him outside the hardware shop while he bought the part. They got coffee while it cooled, then he slid under the hood in the parking lot and fixed it on the spot. It took 10 minutes. It told her enough. Word moves fast through any friend group. Tasha, Monique, and Natalie watched with protective eyes. One invited him to a backyard cookout just to see how he handled a crowd. He asked what he could bring, showed up early and left late after hauling bags to the curb. Another asked about long days. How did he treat people when he was tired? He answered without speeches, by rinsing pans, refilling coolers, offering to drive someone home who'd had too much. By the end of the night, 3 different texts reached Brianna. He's solid. Cole preferred simple places. A booth at a diner off Hillsborough Street, a walk through Pullen Park when the air cooled, a drive on quiet roads where conversation didn't have to compete with noise. He listened, not the kind of listening where someone is waiting to talk, real listening, where he remembered names, followed up on small things, and noticed when she changed the subject to avoid a tender spot. He never pressed. He let trust set its own speed. At church, people began to associate them. Brianna and Cole, the couple that stayed behind to fold tables and pick up stray programs. Parents liked him because children liked him. Kids tugged on his sleeve and asked about the tool belt he kept in the truck. Older members liked him because he didn't posture. He gave up his chair, carried boxes, and left rooms better than he found them. In a community that respects work, he fit. There are moments you can point to later and say, that's where the promise began. For them, it was a thunderstorm in July. Lightning took down a line 2 blocks from Brianna's building, the power died with a soft click, and the hallway fell into blue-gray shadow. Before she could text, Cole was there, flashlight in his pocket, phone on speaker as he waited on the utility hold line. He checked the breaker panel, told her what to expect, and stayed until the hum returned and the refrigerator kicked back to life. He didn't make a scene of it. He just sat with her on the couch while the rain ran off the balcony, and said he'd be there any time it went dark again. He said it like a fact, not a flourish. The promise wasn't a ring yet. It was presence. Brianna's friends saw something else too. She laughed more, slept better, said we without flinching. The heaviness she carried after her mother's funeral began to lift, not because anyone told her to be strong, but because someone stood next to her long enough for strength to return on its own. Ask yourself, how do you measure safety? Is it words, or is it habits you can set a watch by? Introducing a relationship to a parent is another kind of test. Sunday dinner at the Ellington home was simple: roast chicken, vegetables, iced tea sweating on the table. Pastor Marcus Ellington set out plates and asked polite questions. Work hours, family, plans. Cole answered plainly. Project logs start early. Jobs sometimes run late. Bills are paid before anything else. Marcus nodded at the right times, his smile even, his tone gracious. To anyone else, it looked like approval. But unease is a small thing with a long shadow. It shows up in questions that circle the same ground. It shows up in a gaze that lingers a beat too long. It shows up when a father, used to being the anchor in every room, recognizes a new center of gravity forming where he cannot stand. We felt it in the space between compliments, how they never quite reached warmth, how they measured instead of welcomed. Cole never pushed. He offered help at the church when extra hands were needed, stringing lights for the fall festival, rewiring a flickering fixture in the youth room, loading cases for the food pantry. People thanked him. Marcus nodded. The nods didn't soften. We saw the contrast clearly, Brianna's joy widening with each quiet milestone. First holiday together, first shared calendar, first time she let herself plan a future out loud, against a father's stillness that hardened by degrees. No arguments, no raised voices. Just a temperature shift that made rooms feel cooler when the three of them shared the same air. At a friend's engagement party, Cole stood to toast with words as simple as the man who spoke them. He promised to love Brianna without conditions, to carry his share of the weight, to show up on the good days and the ones that fray at the edges. There was no spectacle in it. He spoke like he worked, steady, specific, accountable. When he finished, the room lifted. You could feel it. People set down whatever reservations they had and decided to believe in what they saw. Everyone, almost. Marcus began inviting Cole to men's breakfasts, to planning meetings, to church maintenance days that ended with quiet conversations in the office. The subjects were practical: budgets, timelines, building codes, but the focus kept returning to Cole himself, what he thought about commitment, about authority, about the demands of a family under a public eye. On paper it made sense, a pastor vetting the man who might marry his daughter. In practice, the attention felt tight, like a question you've already answered being asked again to see if your voice shakes. Brianna didn't see it at first. Love has a way of setting the foreground in sharp focus and letting the background blur. What she saw was a partner who showed up and a father who hosted dinners. She saw schedules aligning, not friction sharpening. Her friends saw enough to exchange glances when Marcus asked for Cole's time again, but even they gave the benefit of the doubt. After all, a father has a right to know the man who will join his family, right? We turned the lens a little wider. Cole at work, climbing ladders, checking lines, writing notes on clipboards with dates neat as print. Brianna at her desk, smiling at a photo on her phone between emails. Their weekends found a rhythm: brunch at a spot in Boylan Heights, errands, an afternoon walk by the lake at Shelley. Small promises layered into larger ones. I'll pick you up, text me when you get home, I'll be there by 6. If reliability had a shape, it looked like marks on a calendar that always matched the day itself. Marcus attended, observed, gathered details. He wasn't absent, he was present everywhere, the way a shepherd is present. Visible, necessary, central. Yet the more Cole's presence settled into the family's orbit, the more the air seemed to thin when Marcus entered the room. Not hostility, not welcome either. Something in between that didn't have a polite name. Ask yourself, have you ever watched a smile that means stay slowly become a smile that means keep your distance? We did. It happened in micro moments, a hand that didn't quite complete a handshake, a compliment that arrived without warmth, a question that probed when the conversation had already moved on. Brianna tried to bridge it with grace, Cole met it with patience, Marcus met patience with scrutiny. The proposal was private. Cole chose a quiet spot at Pullen Park near the bridge where the water folds light into ripples. He didn't hire a photographer or stage a crowd. He brought a ring he could afford, and a promise he could keep. When Brianna said yes, she cried into his shoulder and laughed at the same time, that strange sound joy makes when it finally believes itself. The circle widened, calls to friends, a dinner that turned into a celebration, a small flood of messages from people who had been waiting for this news. Plans began. Venues, dates, lists. Cole didn't disappear into them, he carried them. Deposits made on time, vendors called back, schedules matched so that no one else had to chase the details. The friends who once tested him now defended him when someone circled back with old doubts. The community took its cues and leaned in with help. One person did not lean. Marcus reviewed budgets, offered contacts, introduced them to people who could smooth logistics. Helpful, yes. Also watchful, with a current under the surface that pulled harder as the date drew closer. His questions cut narrower. His presence grew sharper. If most fathers measure a future son-in-law and then ease, he measured and measured again. We framed the moment that gives this chapter its name at a simple midweek dinner. Brianna reached for Cole's hand. He reached back and without ceremony, repeated the promise he had made since the first storm knocked the lights out. I'm here. I'll carry what's mine. I'm not going anywhere. It wasn't a performance. It was the same old promise, clarified by time. The room went quiet enough to hear silverware settle on china. Brianna's smile held the whole future in it. The friends at the table felt something settle, like a house finally sitting square on its foundation. If you were there, you would have believed that every piece now had its place. But across the table, a father's jaw tightened by a fraction. His eyes stayed on Cole a beat too long. Approval never arrived. Something else did. To Marcus, Cole wasn't just a future son-in-law. He was a forbidden desire. Brianna's father, Marcus Ellington, lived by clocks and checklists. In Raleigh, people called him Pastor Marcus, and most days that title did all the talking. He arrived early, stayed late, and kept the church moving like a service schedule. Doors unlocked, chairs straight, microphones tested, programs stacked where they needed to be. If a task belonged to no one, he took it. If a plan wobbled, he steadied it. Years before, breast cancer took his wife. The town remembers the casseroles, the cards, the way he preached the next Sunday with a voice that did not crack. After the funeral, he raised Brianna alone. Curfews were clear. Check-ins were expected. Calendars lived on the fridge and in his pocket. People pointed to that order and called it love you could see. In a community that prizes steadiness, he seemed like the safe middle of every room. Hospitals knew his steps in their corridors. He didn't crowd nurses, didn't linger when families needed privacy. He sat. He prayed when asked. He left before comfort became pressure. At food drives and fundraisers, he made lists, crossed them off, and returned calls before the day ended. He didn't tell stories about what he'd done. He did them and moved on. That's how a reputation builds here, one completed errand at a time. His office spoke the same language. Files in order, dates where you could find them, a photograph of his wife, a smaller one of Brianna tucked into the frame. Keys hung on a labeled hook. The desk surface stayed clear. If you stopped by with a question, he listened first and answered second. The maintenance crew liked that he noticed leaks before they stained. Donors liked that he sent numbers without being asked twice. We learned to trust the rhythm. If Marcus promised it, it happened. He fathered with the same precision. When Brianna started a new job, he followed her car home the first night. When she volunteered on Saturdays, he knew the exact hour she'd be back. If a plan changed, he didn't scold. He simply asked for the new time and wrote it down. Ask yourself, how often do we fold control into care because it looks so much like the same thing? His grief did not live in public. He marked the loss with a scholarship in his wife's name and an annual fundraiser, then turned the page to the next assignment. He did not linger on stories. He placed memory on the shelf like a book whose spine stays uncracked, present but closed. The congregation filled the silence with respect. No one pressed. Why would they? The doors opened on time. The sermons ended at the hour. The work got done. Yet even pillars cast a shadow if you stand close. We noticed small flares of resistance. Plans that irritated him when they were made without his hand on them, a meeting that ran over time and left him tight around the eyes, the rare locked office door late at night when the building should have been dark. Nothing you could pin to paper. Enough to make you glance twice. Curiosity tugs hardest when the surface is spotless. Brianna learned her way through that order as naturally as breathing. She knew which closet held the tablecloths, which cabinet kept the cups no one could find, which switch made the fellowship hall lights buzz if you didn't press it just right. When she brought Cole Harrington into that orbit, she did it with the confidence of someone introducing two parts meant to fit. Cole worked, he showed up, he left rooms better than he found them. The congregation nodded, friends nodded. Marcus listened. He asked good questions. Good, because they sounded ordinary. Work hours, schedules, what Cole thought about commitment when the calendar got crowded. The tone stayed polite, the smile even. But a second current ran under the surface, attention measured by ounces, revisited by degrees. If most fathers test once and ease, Marcus tested and returned for the same answers again, as if truth were a number that could change when no one was looking. We're not here to accuse. We're here to record the room as it felt. A respected pastor, a careful father, a man whose habits made other people's days simpler, a man the town leaned on because that's what towns do when someone holds the line. If you were new, you learned quickly. When plans fray, find Marcus. When decisions stall, ask Marcus. When the hour grows late and the building needs to close, wait. Marcus will check the doors himself. Hold that image. Then place one more detail beside it, but Marcus's grief carried a secret he never confessed. We won't name it here. Not yet. Suspense lives where facts and timing hold hands. What matters for this page is how the room tightened when calendars turned toward the ceremony. Rehearsal meant run-throughs, seating charts, microphones checked one last time. Marcus walked the center aisle, program in hand, calls made, arrivals confirmed. He did what he always did, made the event behave. Brianna took her mark. Friends settled into their rows. The coordinator whispered the order. And across from Marcus, in the place where family and future meet, stood the man the town already respected on his own terms, Cole. Dependable, present, steady enough to be trusted with the person Marcus loved most. Do you feel the air pull? We did, not loud, not obvious. Just a shift. The smallest proof that order can tense when something inside it does not bend. The congregation would have called this moment ordinary. A rehearsal, nothing more. But for those of us watching closely, the edges of the scene sharpened. Expression, distance, a pause that lasted a heartbeat longer than protocol requires. Details that ask to be remembered precisely because they are easy to overlook. Keep your focus there, keep your questions ready. The story will give you answers only when the time is right. That secret was standing right across from him at the altar rehearsal. It began as help, nothing more. After Sunday service, Pastor Marcus Ellington asked Cole Harrington to stay a few minutes and walk the ceremony flow. Programs, songs, order of vows, items anyone could discuss in the open hall. Instead, Marcus guided him down the corridor and into the office, door eased shut, blinds half drawn. The talk started with logistics and drifted, work stress, sleep, private doubts. When Cole shifted back toward schedules, Marcus circled to feelings, then to temptations men carry, a topic that didn't belong to wedding bullet points. The meeting ended with a hand on Cole's shoulder, a beat too long to be casual. Another night arrived with a message. Could Cole swing by to look at a flickering light above the baptistry? He came with a tool bag, The fixture didn't misbehave once. Marcus thanked him, then asked him to sit for a minute. The minute stretched. Questions came dressed as care. Was he truly ready for marriage? Did he ever fear being misunderstood? Had he felt drawn in ways he couldn't say aloud? Cole stood to leave. Marcus stepped closer, voice low, calling this the kind of honesty men share. Cole nodded, non-committal, and found the door. We've all felt it. The moment a meeting changes temperature, do you name it, or do you keep the peace and exit clean? Premarital counseling should have been the three of them. Marcus split it. Individual sessions help, he said. Brianna's calendar received hers. Cole's calendar received more than one. In those one-on-ones, prayer replaced questions and then returned to them. Words about accountability gave Marcus license to revisit topics already answered. He asked what desire felt like when the room was quiet. He asked what kept Cole up at night. He asked how often he needed release from pressure, phrases that turned confession into a narrowing corridor. Each time Cole pressed for couple sessions, each time Marcus said privacy would build strength. Cole hid the discomfort from Brianna, not because she couldn't handle it, because the date was close and stress was already a guest at the table. He changed subjects when she asked if counseling was helpful, and deflected with simple answers. Yes, we covered the vows. Yes, we're prepared. Then he set alarms to avoid any meeting that might slide past dark. Marcus broadened the reach. A men's breakfast invite came with the time and address. When Cole arrived, no other men appeared. Pancakes, black coffee, and a chair placed too close at the far end of a long table. The topic returned: readiness, doubt, the kind of loneliness that makes a man choose a different path. Cole moved his chair by inches, subtle, firm. Marcus leaned in anyway, shaping questions that sounded pastoral and felt like surveillance. Another day brought an errand. Help me move a few boxes at the parsonage? A reasonable request. 2 hours, maybe less. The boxes proved light. They were done in 20 minutes. Then came talk. Marcus stepped into the doorway, as if to keep it conversational and contained. He spoke about losing his wife, about how silence can fill a house, about how it can fill a person. Grief, yes. But the turn after grief wasn't memory. It was focus, gaze held, words softening around the edges. Cole thanked him, said he needed to go, and did. Pattern reveals itself in repetition. Long conversations that start practical and veer personal. Invitations framed as service that end as interviews. Touch packaged as encouragement. Contact at a shoulder, a brush at the forearm, that lingers past courtesy. None of it explosive, all of it cumulative. We saw the two versions of Marcus begin to separate in public view. In group settings, the pastor everyone expected, composed, helpful, steady. In corridors and offices, a man who pressed past comfort into private ground he hadn't been invited to. If grief is a language, this didn't sound like it. It sounded like scouting, testing where the lines were and who would draw them. Cole drew them quietly. He shortened meetings, kept doors open, positioned chairs with space between. He started bringing tasks into view. Work done in the sanctuary, not the office. Lights checked in the open, not at midnight. He answered direct questions with tidy truths and left nothing extra on the table. He never raised his voice. He never accused. He chose distance and routine, the human version of guardrails. Have you ever tried to protect peace by pretending nothing is wrong? How long can that hold when the other person keeps closing the gap? Marcus noticed the distance. The asks got tighter. 10 minutes, that's all. Stop by on your way home, let's pray. Just the two of us. When Cole declined, another message came later, phrased as spiritual urgency, implying that refusal meant avoidance rather than a reasonable boundary. The pressure didn't roar, it pulsed. Brianna watched clocks and budgets, not subtext. Cole kept it that way, answering her texts fast, arriving when he said, stepping into logistics with a competence that had won everyone over. If there was strain, he carried it alone, deciding that one more week of courtesy was easier than introducing a conflict he couldn't fully name. The invitations grew stranger, a late-night request to review ceremony symbolism that could have been a single email, a suggestion that Cole confess in detail to clear his conscience and enter the wedding clean. A pause in a hallway that required Cole to sidestep to pass. Small things, each deniable on its own. Together, a map. We frame it precisely. Marcus wasn't grieving. He was grooming. Not in words spoken aloud, but in the shape of his choices. Not in a declaration, but in the pressure of proximity. The insistence on privacy. The slow drift from guidance to fixation. If you were standing in those rooms, you'd feel it. The air thinning, the clock hands suddenly loud, the door a little too far away. Cole held the line. He kept the doors open. He kept the conversations short. He kept the promises that mattered most. But pressure seeks the moment before celebration, because that's when people are least willing to light a fire. The calendar crept toward the date everyone knew. Rehearsals loomed, the town prepared to smile for photos. But on the eve of the wedding, Marcus would cross a line that Cole could never forgive. The fellowship hall glowed under rented strings of soft bulbs, tables set in neat rows, name cards tucked beside plates. A small cake waiting for the practice slice. Family and friends filled the room with easy noise. Laughter that bounced off cinderblock walls, silverware clinking, chairs scraping as cousins traded seats. It looked exactly like the night before a wedding is supposed to look. Hugs, toasts, and quick snapshots that would be forgettable if tomorrow arrived on schedule. Brianna moved through it all with light in her eyes, touching shoulders, squeezing hands, pausing every time someone said tomorrow like it was a blessing. Cole stayed in motion, pulling extra chairs from the storage closet, adjusting a wobble under one table, retrieving a grandmother's shawl when the AC ran too cold. He never made the moment about himself. He kept it running so everyone else could enjoy it. At the far end, Pastor Marcus Ellington watched, not the way a host watches for empty cups or guests who need seats. He tracked Cole. When Cole laughed with Brianna's friends, Marcus's gaze stayed fixed. When Cole crossed the room to help an uncle with the coffee urn, Marcus followed him with his eyes, blinking slow, measuring. Show of hospitality. Thanking volunteers, blessing the food. But the attention kept drifting back to the same point on the map. The toasts were small and sweet. Tasha told a story about a flat tire, and Cole's quiet rescue in the rain. Monique joked about Brianna's first text, "He's different," and how none of them believed it until they saw it themselves. Cole raised his glass and thanked them for guarding the woman he loved. He looked at Brianna while he said it, not at the room. The applause came quick and warm. From the head table, Marcus tapped his glass and stood. He spoke of commitment and steadiness, how a marriage takes daily work, how showing up is the truest proof of love. The words were right, the cadence was smooth. But when he turned to Cole to offer a blessing, his voice lowered and the choices grew narrow. Are you ready for everything this family requires? Are you ready for the wait? Are you ready for me to walk closely with you as a man? He smiled when he said it. People clapped anyway. We felt the temperature dip. Dinner dissolved into cleanup. Brianna's friends gathered, plates, older relatives fished for leftovers for the road. Cole stacked chairs 6 high and carried them back to storage. Marcus drifted near the exit, intercepting anyone who tried to help. I've got it, thank you, head on out, we'll lock up. The room thinned to a few stragglers, then to 2. Cole wheeled the final cart of folded tables into the corridor behind the hall. The fluorescent light hummed, the storage door clicked shut. When he turned, Marcus was already there, standing too close for a casual goodnight. Appreciate you, Marcus said, voice faint, almost private. You handle pressure well. Cole nodded. Whatever helps. Walk with me a moment, Marcus added, not waiting for an answer. He led him past the kitchen, into the smaller side room where extra hymnals and program boxes lived. The door came to behind them, soft, deliberate. No lock, just intent. What followed didn't sound like father-in-law talk. Marcus began with gratitude, then shifted to those honest things between men he'd used in counseling, longing, loneliness, the need to be understood. He spoke of silence in an empty house, of nights that stretched too long, of wanting something that made the quiet stop. The words narrowed, thinned, sharpened. He told Cole he thought about him. He told him he felt pulled. He told him the pull had a name that had nothing to do with mentorship or marriage prep. Cole went still. The kind of still that isn't fear, just calculation. Where's the door? What's the cleanest exit? What won't ruin the night for Brianna? He angled his shoulders, left hand tightening on the table edge, until the plastic folded table creaked. We should head back, he said, neutral as a level line. Marcus stepped closer. Not a stumble, a choice. His hand lifted, hovered, settled at Cole's forearm as if blessing needed a pulse to find its way. He said he wanted a space where they could be honest. He said honesty demanded response. He said proximity was proof. The room shrank. The hallway hum felt louder than it should. Minutes stretched thin, air thinner. Cole removed the hand from his arm and set it back in the space between them, firm but not violent. He kept his voice level. "This isn't that," he said. "I love Brianna." Marcus's breath shortened, barely audible, too close. He said things about secrecy and trust, about how confession could bind men in ways a ceremony never could. He closed the gap another inch. Here is the emotional beat, precise and uncluttered. Cole's shock didn't come with anger, it came with clarity. Lines drawn, promises remembered. A door pressed open with an elbow, space reclaimed in an airless room. "You're in the corridor with us now. Can you feel the choice harden? Do you count the seconds, the breaths, the distance to the exit? Would you announce it, or would you hold the tone steady and let the word carry its own weight?" Cole didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain himself twice. He gave a single answer that fit the size of the moment and the size of his promise. Cole said no. And that single word sealed his fate. Night fell over Raleigh with the plainness of any other Friday before a wedding. Streetlights blinked on. Porch bulbs clicked to life up and down the block. In Brianna's apartment, a garment bag hung unzipped. Shoes lined side by side like a promise laid out and waiting. The clock moved. The messages stacked. Cole didn't come home. He wasn't the kind of man who went quiet for long. His routine was a map you could trust. A quick text when he left, a call if he ran late, a photo of takeout on night's work ate the evening. The thread stayed still, minutes slid into an hour. If someone you love goes silent, how long before fear speaks louder than patience? We watched Brianna try the practical steps first, check the calendar, check the charger, check the route he would take. She sent a single message that didn't crowd him, "Everything okay?" The read receipt never appeared. The apartment held its breath. Across town, the church lot sat mostly empty under a humming pole lamp. By midnight, the last event chair had been returned to storage, and the fellowship hall lights dimmed to their overnight glow. All that should have remained was the stillness of a building sleeping between days. Instead, one sedan stayed where it shouldn't, Cole's car, parked near the side entrance, as if its driver had stepped away just for a minute and never stepped back. At dawn, a volunteer came to prep coffee and open doors for an early group. She noticed the car before she reached her keys. Same spot, no change. Later, an usher took a slow pass by the windows and glanced inside. No jacket tossed on the seat, no overnight bag, nothing to explain a vehicle that had outlasted the night. The engine was cool, the lot was quiet. The uneasy detail was simple. If Cole had gone home, the car would have gone with him. Word moved quickly but carefully. In a town that tries to protect good news until it's certain, people still make calls. Friends reached friends. A text hopped to Brianna. "Hey, is Cole with you?" She answered with a single word that felt like a door closing. "No." The whispers began to form, shaped by guesswork more than malice. Maybe nerves. Maybe a break for air that turned into a drive. Maybe a second place to sleep just to be rested for tomorrow. We've heard those stories before, told when we need to soften the hard edge of the unknown. But the details in front of us wouldn't bend. No check-in, no drive home, a car abandoned where it shouldn't be. Ask yourself, when absence sits down beside you, do you tell yourself a story, or do you look at the evidence in your hands? Brianna refused the softer story. She knew the man she was marrying. He made promises and then kept them, not because he could perform, but because he believed calendars are contracts and love lives in the ordinary proofs. She called again. She didn't hear a ring. We don't repeat what you've already heard. We record only what changed. Time passing, silence holding, a resolve hardening, that this wasn't nerves and it wasn't retreat. People drove past the church lot slow, as if the car might offer an answer simply because it was forced to stand there and be looked at. The color didn't matter. The make didn't matter. What mattered was the angle. Straight, tidy, too neat for a man who decided to disappear. A runaway leaves sideways, leaves a mess. This was tidy. Tidy raises questions. Inside the building, the air felt thinner than a few hours before. A custodian vacuumed the last of the rehearsal confetti from under the head table, paused, and looked toward the glass doors, at the end of the hall, like the answer might be framed there. It wasn't. The only new thing was the knot people felt in their stomachs when they thought the word missing, and didn't want to speak it yet. We won't tell you what comes later. We stay here, where we are, in the first shock that turns celebration into a problem no one knows how to name. A groom who doesn't go home. A car that keeps his place like a stand-in. A bride who reads a silent thread and refuses to call the worst thing by a smaller name. The community split along the familiar fault lines, those who lean toward mercy and time, those who search for a reason that makes sense now. We can show you the balance without taking sides. On one side, people offering explanations that leave room for a safe return. On the other, people asking harder questions because the facts invited them. Which side would you stand on if it were your friend, your family, your mourning? By late morning, the lot had seen more footsteps than it deserved. Someone traced the path from the driver's door to the sidewalk and back again, as if footprints could be summoned by will. Someone else lifted a flyer box lid, and then lowered it without knowing why. Details piled up like small stones, none heavy alone, all weight together. Then the detail that changed the room arrived, not with a shout, but with a single voice that didn't try to make it sound smaller. A phone, cracked and dark, found in the margin where asphalt gives way to gravel near the shrubs at the edge of the lot. Not set down, not forgotten. Smashed as if the ground had done the breaking, or someone didn't want it speaking anymore. Shock doesn't need volume, it needs proof. We had it in a palm-sized shape that refused to light up, a screen that kept its secrets even when someone pressed the button hard enough to whiten their thumb. Hold here. We do not move beyond what this page allows. We let the quiet build the question that now belongs to everyone who's listening. If Cole had left willingly, why was his phone found smashed near the church lot? Morning arrived without the answer she needed. Brianna sat at the small kitchen table, phone face up, eyes fixed on a screen that stayed still. The dress hung in the doorway like a question she couldn't fold away. She told herself this was a delay, not an ending. People run late, batteries die, doors stick. Hope can be stubborn when it has a future to protect. She started with the list anyone would make. Calls, messages, a loop through names who might have seen him. Friends checked their threads, neighbors checked their porches, nothing new. Each no felt smaller than the one before it, and somehow heavier. She didn't cry now. She held her breath as if silence could coax a vibration from the phone. By midday she was at the church, because that's where answers should live when a life turns sideways. She moved through the foyer with steps that wanted to run and forced themselves not to. Pastor Marcus Ellington met her at the doors, arms open, face arranged in calm that looked practiced. He wrapped her in the kind of hug that tells a room the family's together and strong. People watching saw what they needed to see, a father steadying a daughter. In the quiet of his office the calm thinned. He closed the door and began to tidy what didn't need tidying. Papers into neat piles, a pen placed parallel to the folder's edge, blinds adjusted one slat at a time. Brianna stood there, holding the unanswered phone with both hands as if it might jump. She asked the only question that mattered. Had he seen Cole after cleanup? Did they speak? Was there anything she should know? Marcus answered in sentences that brushed the subject and moved past it. Logistics, tasks, the way a late night can blur details. He promised they would pray, they would organize, they would do what was required. His voice was soft, then too soft, then clipped. The room felt smaller, the air closer. She pressed again. A direct question. He gave a softer version of the same answer. The pen moved back into its line. She left his office with a plan that was mostly motion, rooms to check, people to call, spaces to stand in while the next hour arrived. We followed her through hallways that had always meant welcome and now meant waiting. She paused at the sanctuary doors and looked down the aisle she was supposed to walk. The quiet inside felt wrong, like a song cut mid-note. Ask yourself what you would do, sit in a pew and pray, or keep moving so the stillness doesn't catch you. In public, Marcus stayed beside her like a headline. He fielded questions with careful words, guided volunteers, signed his name where signatures were needed. He told people the family was holding together, that they were grateful for help, that updates would come. Shoulders were touched, hands were held. An entire community shaped its concern around his posture. In private he frayed, not wildly, not loudly, at the edges. A door checked twice, a light switched off, then on, then off again. A sentence started, and abandoned mid-thought. He refused offers to rest with a curt shake of the head, and then sat down anyway, only to stand moments later. When Brianna stepped toward him with a new question, he redirected toward a task that didn't matter. The desk drawer closed a little too fast. She clung to what she knew. The man she loved kept his word. The man she loved did not disappear. She repeated that to herself without speaking it aloud, because saying it would make the room feel like a courtroom, and she wasn't ready for witnesses. She gripped the back of a chair and steadied her hands. We all choose a sentence to stand on when the floor shifts. What would yours be? Afternoon blurred into evening. People came and went with the brisk purpose of those who need to be useful. Flyers were discussed. Call lists formed. Doors opened and closed with a steady rhythm that failed to comfort. Through it all, Brianna moved like someone refusing to surrender the shape of her life. She asked clear questions. She wrote down the answers. She corrected anything that sounded like rumor. When someone tried to tell her to sleep, she shook her head and kept going. Marcus kept pace beside her when eyes were on them. He drifted when they weren't. In an empty hallway he stood with his back to the wall, eyes on nothing. When she approached, he straightened too quickly, words rushing in a tangle before settling into a smoother register. He suggested she step outside for air. He offered water he didn't fetch. By early evening, uniforms appeared. Calm voices, measured steps, notepads. They didn't accuse, they gathered. They asked for timelines, for last messages, for the practical map of a day that had refused to end correctly. Brianna answered precisely. What time they parted, where he said he would go, when the silence began. She kept her replies short so the room wouldn't hear her voice shake. Then came the careful question that turns a search into a file with tabs. Who last saw Cole alive? It was asked gently. It was asked again, the way you ask a detail that matters. The hallway carried the words farther than the officer intended. People heard without meaning to. Names were tried like keys in a lock. The coordinator, a friend who stayed late, a relative who left early. Each one put a hand up and stepped back. Not me. The circle tightened with nowhere else to go. Heads turned in a slow involuntary arc toward the same point, and even though no one said the conclusion out loud, we felt it settle in the air like dust after a door closes. Mini cliffhanger. And when investigators asked who last saw Cole alive, Marcus's name kept surfacing. Interviews began before the sun burned off the morning haze. Plain notebooks, calm voices, doors closed with a soft latch along the hall that had hosted rehearsals the night before. Names were taken, times were written. No one was accused. Everyone was asked to remember exactly, not generally. A volunteer who handled programs sat straight-backed in a metal chair and kept her answers in sequence. She remembered Pastor Marcus Ellington asking Cole Harrington to walk the ceremony after most people had left. She remembered the two of them stepping into the corridor, the office door easing shut, the hallway light humming until she turned it off and went home. No raised voices, just the shape of a late conversation that didn't belong to cleanup. An usher recalled the same quiet, Marcus and Cole side by side near the storage closet, heads tipped close, not the kind of posture you take when you're discussing chair counts. He'd gone back for a roll of tape and, when he returned, both men were gone and the corridor was empty. Time noted. Door remembered. Silence recorded. Down the street, neighbors added another layer in steady, careful lines. One said Marcus's car had been out later than usual the past few weeks. Headlights cutting across the parsonage lawn at hours that didn't match committee meetings or hospital visits. Another mentioned seeing the sedan idle at the side lot after midnight. Engine turning over for a minute, then shutting off as if the driver couldn't decide whether to stay or go. They weren't gossiping, they were marking time against what they knew of a man who liked clocks. Back inside the church, a custodian described finishing the floors in the fellowship hall and hearing conversation through the thin wall of the side room. Not loud, more like a recording set low. Cadences without words, pauses too long for logistics. He'd assumed it was counseling and kept the buffer a worker learns to keep. The investigators didn't press what he heard. They wrote when he heard it. A bridesmaid remembered that Marcus had intercepted anyone who tried to help with closing duties. "I've got it, thank you, go ahead," repeated with the same soft insistence until the room thinned to only a few. She left when asked. She couldn't say what happened after that, only that the building felt different as she stepped outside, like a song cut short. We moved between those rooms with the patience the moment required and the urgency it deserved. Every account added a pin to the map. None solved the map. Then a grounds worker unlocked the bin enclosure beside the fellowship hall and found something he shouldn't have, a dark jacket folded wrong, as if it had been bundled in one motion and tossed overhand toward the dumpster wall. He didn't touch it, he called it in. A careful set of hands lifted it into evidence. The lining carried a stitch tag, the contractor's logo Cole wore on jobs. The cuff held a scuff that matched the way he pushed sleeves when he worked. There was no blood. There didn't need to be. A groom's jacket didn't belong there. The discovery didn't shout, it reset the room. A jacket near trash means haste or secrecy, not preparation. Not a man making careful choices on the eve of vows. The questions tightened. Who had access to the lot after midnight? Who held keys to this door and that one? Who could lock from the inside and walk out without setting off alarms? Those answers lived on one ring in one office, with spares distributed under Marcus's oversight. People knew that. They had always trusted it. Now they recited it like a list they wished were shorter. Marcus stepped into his interview with the composure the town expected. He sat upright. He placed his hands on his knees. He kept his voice even. He traced his evening from blessing the food to dismissing helpers, from stacking chairs to turning off lights. He acknowledged a brief talk with Cole, order of service, last details, and he dated it to the moment before volunteers finished. He didn't deny the corridor. He didn't linger on it either. When asked about the hour after, his phrases shifted, wrapping up, checking doors, securing the building. They were tasks he did nightly. They weren't a clock. We do not add what he didn't say. We hold to what was recorded, a conversation acknowledged, a timeline without firm corners, a pastor who had the run of a building, and a reason to be the last to leave. The grounds workers' fine brought investigators back to the lot. They walked the margin where asphalt gives to gravel, then the narrow strip of shrubs that lines the bin enclosure. A torn thread snagged on a low branch. Footprints were little help, the ground was too dry to take a clear impression. But the distance between the place where the jacket landed and the path to the side door measured in steps anyone with a key could cover in seconds. Around the edges, the community continued talking to itself. Some leaned hard into the simplest story, a man overwhelmed by the moment who stepped away without planning to. Others couldn't reconcile the abandoned car, the silent phone, and a jacket folded into a life it didn't belong to. You can hear both stories without choosing one. You can ask yourself which one fits the items in front of you. More interviews, small scope and meticulous. A choir member remembered leaving a bottled water on the counter between the kitchen and hall. In the morning it was gone. Not proof, pattern. A neighbor 2 doors down from the parsonage said she heard a car door close late. 1 door, not 2. And tires on pavement. A short drive, then quiet. She didn't get up. She regretted not getting up. Regret isn't evidence. Regret is just a note in the margin of what might matter later. Inside the office, the key ring hung on its usual hook when the door opened for questions. That mattered to some. The ring could have been returned by anyone who had it. The drawers were shut. The blinds were even. Order can survive a night like any other night, if the person keeping it decides it should. Brianna kept her focus where it needed to be: timelines, names, locations. She didn't speak in the rooms where the interviews were conducted. She waited outside, palms pressed tight around her phone as if pressure alone could pull a notification out of a silent device. When someone needed a date or a time, she provided it and stepped back. Her face was pale. Her voice was steady. We won't tell you what's coming next. We stay with the facts that landed on this page and the shape they make when you set them side by side. Late-night conversations behind a closed door. A pastor's car seen out past midnight more than once. A groom's jacket found near a dumpster where no piece of a wedding should be. A timeline that holds steady until it doesn't. Direct question for anyone listening. If a man plans to run, does he leave his car neat, his phone silent, and his jacket near trash behind the place where he was last seen? Or do those items point somewhere else? Somewhere closer, somewhere uncomfortable to say out loud? The pen paused above the final line of a form. It didn't drop a conclusion. It wrote the next step. The police started to wonder, was this really a runaway groom, or a cover-up? The search moved from parking lots and hallways to screens and signal trails. Paper timelines gave way to login stamps, app badges, and a calendar that lived behind a passcode. What had looked like silence began to hum when the lights dimmed and the building emptied. Activity without witnesses, windows that opened only after midnight. It started with a routine request. Device lists for the church Wi-Fi. The admin pulled the logs and found an unfamiliar handset that joined late at night under the guest network. Same MAC address repeating on Thursdays and Fridays, often after 11. The signal bled strongest from the office wing. The name field was blank. The timestamps fit a man who prided himself on locking doors after everyone else had gone home. In Marcus's office, order still performed on cue, files aligned, blinds even, keyring on its hook. But the drawers told a different story. The top one clicked once, then twice, then slid open to reveal a felt pouch snug against the back. Inside, a slim prepaid phone with no case. No contacts labeled in plain English, and a battery percentage that suggested careful upkeep. Not the device everyone saw, not the number on membership rolls and prayer chains. A phone that lived only in private time. The handset wasn't empty, it carried apps that don't announce themselves. Icons tucked into a folder with harmless names, notifications set to silent, previews turned off. The usernames were simple, the bios restrained, single, discreet, local. The location toggled between precise and hidden, as if the owner kept wrestling himself back into shadow after each reach toward light. Messages crossed months. They began with careful courtesy and slid by degrees into questions that tested boundaries and cataloged desire. We read them as they were, not as we wished they weren't. Late-night exchanges with men in neighboring zip codes. Invitations framed as prayer that became requests for photos. Compliments that clung too long to age and shape. Fantasies couched in scripture-adjacent language. Bending words that once held a different weight. The pattern wasn't an explosion. It was a steady drip. A rehearsal for something spoken louder when the room had only 2 people in it. Search history added more threads. Tutorials on restoring deleted chats. Articles about anonymous numbers. Map pins dropped and cleared. A string of how-to queries that all orbited the same objective. Keep what is private truly private. The browser's cache had been wiped too often to be casual. The habit wasn't new, it had grooves. Around the church, older stories resurfaced when questions were asked with dates attached. A volunteer from years back remembered a counseling session that didn't end when it should. She left the congregation soon after, taking the exit door no one watched. A visiting soloist cut a season short after a series of check-in messages at hours that didn't respect mourning. A young deacon's spouse once complained about a meeting that never included a second person, despite policy to the contrary. Each time, the disquiet had been diffused with language that sounded pastoral. Misunderstandings, spiritual burden. Guarding the reputation of the work over the messiness of the worker. Gatekeepers had helped, sometimes without knowing what they were protecting. Concerns arrived, were softened and vanished into minutes that never made it to the newsletter. A board meeting held in the side room ended with a prayer against gossip. An apology was delivered for overstepping, and the offended party was thanked for their grace. The congregation applauded the reconciliation they were told had occurred. The ledger closed, the ledger never forgets. We framed what the data suggested without stepping past it. Repression dressed itself as discipline in daylight, and became something hungrier when the building emptied. The holy man had not only lost a wife, he'd buried more than grief. Each unchecked night made the next easier to justify. Each erased message trained the hand that followed. If desire needs a path, secrecy builds roads. Ask yourself, how many routines can a person stack before the routine becomes a room with no doors? How many times can a click and a swipe hide a history before the history starts writing back? The second phone, the one in the felt pouch, linked to email accounts that never appeared on registration forms. One address used to sign in to mail-only chat boards. The posts sparing and careful. Another created only to recover passwords for the first, a shadow of a shadow. Profile photos never showed a face, only a sleeve, a wrist, the suggestion of a man who refused to name himself outside the glow of the screen. Replies followed a pattern. Nervous humor. A reach, a retreat, another reach. The clock in the corner read past midnight most nights. It would be easy to call this a recent fracture. It wasn't. The archive, reconstructed from fragments and backups, reached back years. Spikes in the winter when nights were long, calmer summers, then surges again around anniversaries, and dates the congregation lit candles for. The pattern aligned with the public calendar like a mirror turned one click off true. The day he preached perseverance, the night he begged for someone to see him, the morning he baptized, the evening he scrolled. 2 lives, 1 phone for each. In staff hallways we heard the softer evidence, the kind that doesn't fit into a report but stains memory. The way he stiffened when a conversation wandered near his private hours. How he deflected curiosity with tasks. How he inserted himself into the schedules of the men he found magnetic under lights. Then rope, braided ministry around the attention until leaving would feel like abandoning a calling. No accusations were written on the walls. The paint held. The air knew. There was a folder on the office computer labeled with a date, not a subject. Inside, drafts of emails that were never sent. Each addressed to the same handful of men, each inching dangerously toward disclosure before deleting itself back to a prayer request tone. The drafts read like rehearsals, as if words alone could solve the hunger they kept circling. Repression turned into ritual. Begin, confess, erase, repeat. The deeper the investigators went, the clearer the divide became between who Marcus was when eyes were on him and who he allowed himself to be when blue light was the only witness. This wasn't about sermons, it wasn't about doctrine, it was about a man who engineered a life sturdy enough to survive inspection and thin enough to fold when no one watched. He was careful, then careless, then careful again. The graph looked like a heartbeat trying to hammer itself back into a steady rhythm. Community memory is another database, messy and essential. A former choir director, now living 2 counties away, remembered a talk after a late rehearsal that left him tense for weeks. He'd filed it under odd pastoral concern, told himself he was overreacting, and resigned at the end of the quarter citing schedule conflicts. A facilities volunteer remembered being asked to leave the building key in Marcus's box just in case more than once on nights when no events were scheduled. A family friend remembered receiving a text meant for someone else, a compliment that belonged in a different conversation, and then the immediate follow-up, wrong person, forgive me. She did. She deleted it. She never forgot it. We're not here to assign motive, we're here to map the room. The map included a private phone, hidden accounts, late-night logins, and threads that had nothing to do with ceremony flow. It included rumors the church managed by keeping them small enough to slide off a ledger. It included a man who wore pillar well enough to keep inspection at bay. Direct question for those of us listening together. If repression doesn't vanish, where does it go? Does it evaporate, or does it condense, drop by drop, into places where it finally seeks an outlet? How long can a double life survive, when a real one demands witnesses? The tone in the interview rooms changed once the second phone existed on paper. Questions sharpened. Timestamps asked louder questions than any usher could. App badges whispered longer histories than a pulpit could answer. The polite phrases Marcus used began to sound like the old drafts. Careful, practiced, circling what mattered without letting it land. We end this page where the line turns from quiet discovery to formal demand. A signature, a case number, a carrier name, a date range that wrapped midnights and lunch hours alike. The paperwork slid across the table, crisp edges promising nothing except more edges. And when investigators subpoenaed his phone records, the truth Marcus feared most came to light. The footage was grainy, but the shape moving across the cracked pavement of the lot was unmistakable. A man in a dark jacket, stride familiar, head bent low. The timestamp glowed at the bottom of the screen, same night Cole vanished. And it was Marcus. Investigators played it again, then again. Each rewind sharpened the tension until the air inside the precinct felt too heavy to breathe. They froze the frame, zoomed in, and though the pixels wavered, the silhouette remained damning. He had sworn he'd been at home that night, cocooned in blankets. The screen told a different story. The trail widened. Another camera, another angle. A service station only blocks away from the church. A corner store where he lingered too long. Every clip placed him closer to the scene he claimed never to have seen. Then the lab results landed like hammer strikes. Fibers on Cole's abandoned car matched the upholstery of Marcus's vehicle. Soil caked into the ridges of his boots matched the dirt from the lot's edge. And the faintest trace of blood, so faint it nearly vanished under normal light, flared bright beneath forensic lamps. Evidence was no longer whispering, it was screaming. Brianna hadn't meant to overhear. She had been at the desk sorting forms, pretending to help. But then the officers' voices carried through the cracked door. One word froze her in place. Her father's name. She leaned closer without meaning to. The phrase that followed landed like glass splintering underfoot. He's our prime suspect now. Her pulse crashed in her ears. Prime suspect. Not just questioned. Not just monitored. The center of the storm. Her hand pressed against the counter to steady herself, though her knees buckled beneath the weight of those words. If she moved, if they saw her listening, would they silence themselves? Would they lock the rest away behind closed doors? But it was too late. She had already heard. The precinct walls seemed to shift. Every echo of boots against tile, every shuffle of paper, carried unbearable weight. She could not look at her father the same. She could not pray the same. Even the sanctuary felt poisoned, its shadows now crawling with doubt. And yet, what if they were wrong? What if cameras lied? What if fibers were coincidence? What if the officers were desperate, twisting fragments into a rope to hang the wrong man? The thought gave her the faintest pulse of hope. But it was a hope laced with terror. Because if Marcus wasn't guilty, then someone else still was. Someone unseen, someone out there. But if he was... The question crushed her. She remembered his hands folded in prayer, the fire in his voice when he thundered about sin. What if those same hands had dragged Cole into the dark? The evidence was piling higher, the walls were closing tighter, and now the question wasn't if Marcus was guilty, but how far he would go to hide it. The courtroom felt suffocating. Heat swirled under the gaze of dozens of eyes, all locked on one man. Marcus sat stiff in his chair, his clasped hands trembling though his posture fought to remain steady. His knuckles blanched white against the table. He had battled fiercely, denials, deflections, twisting words into weapons, but the tide had risen too high. Every photograph, every fiber, every sliver of testimony cut deeper. The footage refused to blur into anyone else's face. Then came the offer, a whisper cloaked in finality. Choose between the needle or the cell, death swift, or years gnawing in the dark. When he spoke, his voice rasped low but carried across the room. Guilty. The word exploded like a shot. Brianna's breath collapsed in her chest. The floor might as well have opened beneath her. Her father, the man who had tucked her in with psalms, who thundered warnings against temptation, had spoken the one word she never thought he would. Guilty. The room rippled with gasps, murmurs, curses. Some wept openly. Others stared with cold eyes, lips curling with "I knew it" certainty. For them his fall was confirmation. Proof that saints were only men wearing masks. But Brianna barely heard them. The sound around her blurred into static. Only his voice echoed over and over, a jagged bell tolling in her skull. Had he confessed to spare himself, to spare her the spectacle of a trial? Or had the mountain of evidence stripped him so bare that denial no longer mattered? She wanted to rise, to run, to shout at him, demand truth beyond the plea. But her body would not move. The choice was already made. It had never been hers. The judge's gavel fell, crisp and final. Life without parole. No freedom, no death, a cage that stretched for decades. Life. The word stung. Brianna sat torn between two impossible worlds. In one she clung to blood, to loyalty, to the memory of the father who once held her hand. In the other, she faced truth raw and merciless, acknowledging the monster they now claimed him to be. Which path could she take? The courtroom seemed to turn its gaze upon her. It was not enough that Marcus had confessed. Now it was her verdict they wanted. Was she still his daughter, or was she something else now? Someone unmoored, stripped of anchor and name. The man who had preached salvation would spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. But what would become of her? The sentence had been spoken. The gavel had fallen. The words, "life without parole," echoed long after the courtroom emptied, clinging to the air like smoke that refused to fade. Marcus was gone. Not buried in the earth, but entombed within prison walls, his voice silenced, his presence erased from the pulpit, where he once thundered about truth and salvation. Brianna stood in the silence that followed, her body anchored but her spirit fractured. She had been left with fragments, shards of a future that would never mend. The wedding dress she once cherished still hung untouched, fabric ghostly white against the darkened closet. It had been meant for celebration, for a covenant spoken before her father's blessing. Now it mocked her, unworn, unloved, unusable. The community reeled in disbelief. Congregants who had once raised their hands in worship now pointed fingers in horror. They asked themselves questions that spiraled into darker places. If a pastor could carry a secret this monstrous, who else among them wore masks of virtue? Who else spoke with holy words, while hiding hands stained with unholy acts? The pews were no longer safe. Every familiar face now carried a shadow of suspicion. Some refused to believe it at all. They whispered about conspiracies, about planted evidence, about courts corrupted by jealousy and power. Others clung to the guilty plea as proof enough, nodding grimly and muttering that monsters sometimes wear robes of angels. But no matter the side, no one could meet Brianna's eyes without flinching. The town fractured, friendships dissolved, trust curdled, and whispers traveled faster than truth. Marcus's name was no longer spoken as a shepherd, but as a warning. His legacy had been shattered, not by rumor, but by his own confession carved into the record of the court. His sermons were erased from walls, his books burned quietly in backyards, his memory carried like a disease people feared to catch. And still, Brianna bore the heaviest weight. She carried the bloodline of the man who had fallen. She carried the silence of prayers that went unanswered. She carried the question that could not be put to rest: what part of him lived within her? Nights stretched long and unmerciful. She would lie awake staring at the ceiling, the echo of his voice colliding with the echo of the judge's. The father who once told her she was his pride was now the man branded as a killer. Could those two truths exist in the same body? Could they exist in the same memory? Everywhere she turned, reminders lingered: the church steeple piercing the skyline, the empty seat at the family table, the scent of his aftershave still clinging faintly to the jacket he left behind. She was haunted not by absence, but by presence, by everything that still remained, twisted and tainted. The community asked aloud, but Brianna carried the question deeper than anyone else. If he could hide something this terrible, what else had been hidden all along? The ruined legacy was not his alone. It spilled over into her life, staining the path before her. Friends treated her like an extension of his sin. Strangers stared at her as though she carried the same darkness in her veins. Could she ever build a life free of his shadow, or would every step forward only echo back to him? She thought of the wedding dress again, white fabric, symbol of purity, hope, promise. Would it ever touch her shoulders? Or was it destined to rot in the dark, a relic of a dream crushed under the weight of a name? The pastor had fallen, the father had confessed, the community had fractured. But one question remained unanswered, hanging heavy in the air, waiting for judgment beyond the courtroom. If you discovered your own parent had committed a crime this monstrous, would you protect their secret, or expose them to the world? Share your thoughts. And if you want to witness where stories like this lead, subscribe and stay with us. The shadows are only beginning to speak.